Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're immersing ourselves in the history of Grenada, famously known as the Spice Isle.
And we've got some fantastic material here, yeah. A really rich text that takes us through, well, centuries of the island's story. From the very first people there right up to the challenges Grenada faces today.
Right. And our mission in this deep dive, really crafted just for you listening, is to navigate all that history. We're going to try and pull out the most important bits, uncover some surprising facts maybe, and just help you get well-informed quickly about Grenada's pretty complex past.
It's quite a journey we'll be taking. We're covering colonization, the really brutal era of slavery, moments of powerful resistance.
Yeah, the long road to independence, too.
And then that dramatic revolution, international intervention, and, the ongoing story of resilience. It's a lot packed into such a small place.
It really is. Okay, so let's unpack this. Maybe first, let's just set the scene. Where exactly is Grenada and what's it like today?
Right. So Grenada, it's located off the coast of Venezuela, pretty close to Trinidad and Tobago.
And it's known for just incredible natural beauty, isn't it? Lush, mountainous landscapes, those famous spice plantations, obviously, stunning beaches, and a really vibrant culture, too.
Oh, definitely. You think of the energy around Carnival, with its unique traditions like the jab-jab characters. Really something else.
And it absolutely lives up to that nickname, the Spice Isle.
It really does. It's a major exporter: nutmeg, clove, cinnamon, ginger. And what's fascinating, the source highlights this, is that Grenada is one of the very few places outside Indonesia that successfully grows and markets nutmeg on a significant scale.
Where that fact alone tells you something about its unique place, historically and even now, in the world economy.
Exactly.
And this natural wealth, of course, it played a huge role in its history, colonization, slavery, the fight for independence, all of it. But before all that, who actually called Grenada home originally?
Okay, so the earliest inhabitants, they were Amerindians. They migrated from the Amazonia region of South America, areas like modern-day Brazil, Guyana, Venezuela. They were part of that same big migration wave that settled lots of Caribbean islands, probably after reaching places like Curacao around, say, 2000 BC.
How did they live on the island? What do we know about their lives?
Well, the text says they were initially hunters and fishers. But eventually they settled down, built quite an extensive village at a place called Hunter's Hill that's on the eastern side.
Okay.
Their houses apparently faced inwards towards a central sort of oval communal area. And we find cultural evidence too, like ceremonial sites, mounds for burial, and fertility rites up on the hills.
Interesting.
Yeah. And small carved stones, they look like male phalluses, have been unearthed there. It gives us little glimpses into their beliefs, their practices,
Did they interact much with other groups in the region, or were they isolated?
No, the source indicates they were connected. They definitely engaged in trade with peoples to the north. You can see evidence of this in the ornamental stonework found both on Grenada and other islands too.
So they had an established society, a culture. What happened when the Europeans arrived?
Yeah, this is where the story turns tragic, really. The source says surprisingly little about the specific European impact beyond just describing it as destruction.
Right.
The Spanish allegedly visited in 1498 with Columbus, named it Concepcion, but they didn't settle. Apparently they even dismissed it as worthless in 1519, maybe because there weren't great harbors for their ships at the time.
But the Europeans didn't give up.
No, they kept trying. The French made attempts in 1605, 1606. The Amerindian bowmen put up resistance at first, but the French eventually found an undefended bay and managed to land a garrison.
And the outcome for the Amerindians?
Swift and brutal. Their defeat in battle and guerrilla warfare was rapid. By the time European control was really established, the source notes, most Amerindians across the Caribbean had already been wiped out by disease and, extermination.
So sad.
They were last noted on Grenada itself around 1645.
A near total disappearance of the population, then?
In terms of population, yes. But their impact lingered in other ways. The land they farmed went back to jungle. And the animals the Spaniards introduced, rats, pigs, cattle, wildfowl, they completely altered the ecology.
Right.
So lingering evidence like ruins, stone carvings, artifacts, that's really all that's left to give us insight into their culture.
That really sets a poignant tone for everything that follows. Okay, so the source moves on then to the European colonial struggle, starting with the French settlement.
Right. After those initial failed attempts, the French successfully settled between 1649 and 1651. They drove off the remaining Caribs, settled in large numbers, and France officially annexed the island in 1664.
And this is when the devastating system of slavery really takes root on the island.
Precisely. With the indigenous population effectively gone, the French started importing West African slaves in large numbers to work their expanding plantations, mainly sugar at first.
But French rule wasn't permanent?
No, not at all. During the 7 Years' War, the British captured the island. They took St. George's in 1762.
Oh, okay.
And then Grenada was formally ceded to Britain under the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The British, they just continued and expanded the plantation system, importing even more enslaved Africans. And you also had British loyalists fleeing the American Revolution, settling there towards the end of that war.
And the enslaved population grew to just dominate the numbers on the island.
The source puts it in really stark terms. The enslaved population outnumbered the free population by nearly 10 to 1.
10 to 1, wow.
Yeah. And that demographic reality is just crucial. It created this constant environment of tension, fear among the white minority, which led to frequent rebellions.
Did big events elsewhere, like the French Revolution, have an impact in Grenada? Did the enslaved population react?
Yes. The source definitely notes unrest among the enslaved population in the 1790s was influenced by the ideals coming out of the French Revolution. This all culminated in a major uprising, the Makuba Rebellion, which kicked off in 1795.
And that was put down.
Oh, yes. Very stiff measures were used to suppress it. Slavery itself was ultimately abolished across the British Empire in 1834, though the source adds, interestingly, that this happened before plantation agriculture could be fully mechanized.
What happened to the island's economy right after abolition?
Well, it went into decline. Finding a reliable, sufficient labor force became a huge challenge for the planters.
So what did they do?
This shortage of labor led to the introduction of Indian indentured laborers. They were brought from other British colonies, mostly on 5-year contracts.
All right, let's pause there for a second. Can we look a bit more closely at that period of French rule before British took over? What was society and the economy actually like under the French?
Right, so the French settlers, mainly from places like Normandy and Brittany, they established those first permanent settlements around 1650. They focused on sugar and coffee plantations, mostly, though there was some pepper trade too. These colonists really laid the groundwork for the thriving sugar economy that the British then capitalized on later.
And the society itself, you mentioned something earlier, or the source did, about a distinction regarding free people of color.
Yes, this is a key point the source makes about French rule. It seems, unlike later British practice in some places, the French drew a pretty clear distinction between black slaves and free coloreds, those born of French blood.
Okay.
And these free coloreds were apparently granted the same rights as whites. So while huge numbers of slaves were imported, free coloreds also settled, especially in St. George's. And the source mentions a nil tax rate on them helped their numbers and wealth grow.
So a different social dynamic compared to some other places.
Yeah, definitely different compared to the more rigid systems the British often implemented elsewhere.
How did the French economy actually do during that time? Was it successful?
Generally, yeah, the estates were thriving. Sugar production brought in significant revenue. And the rum they produced was apparently quite good. Won prizes, got international attention.
But not without challenges.
No, definitely challenges. The source mentions heavy rainfall before 1779 affected crops, disrupted sugar grinding. And it also mentions destruction of towns by arriving warships leading to a fall of Grenada right in this section, which seems to jump ahead chronologically to events around 1779.
Yeah, that is a bit jarring in the text.
It kind of disrupts the flow of that particular section in the source, yeah.
But it does underscore the constant disruption the island faced, I suppose. Okay, let's try and smooth out that timeline and move to the British takeover, how they consolidated control between, say, 1762 and 1783.
Right. So the British captured St. George's in May 1762, ending French control. And there was a symbolic shift. 2 new coats of arms, a new flag combining the British lion and the French Bourbon lilies, ship imagery, Latin mottos like sic ut non perit, thus it does not perish, and metus et simplex, gentle and simple.
And the formal handover, when did that happen?
That came with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Grenada was ceded to Britain. Initially, the British seemed focused on establishing it as a coffee plantation colony.
How did they set up the government? Could the French planters participate?
The political system was modified in 1763. French landholders were allowed into the legislature, but only if they took an oath to the British crown.
I can imagine that caused some friction.
Oh, immediately. Predictably, you got disputes right away in the legislature between French and British interests, both vying for supremacy.
And did those tensions escalate?
They did. The source points to punitive measures imposed by one governor, Francis M. Worsley, as particularly angering the French-speaking planters. This contributed to an uprising. even a massacre of British loyalists.
And this was happening around the time of the American Revolution.
Exactly. And in 1779, the colonists on Grenada actually declared their support for France against Britain in that wider conflict.
Did Britain lose control then?
Temporarily. The British managed to retake Grenada in July 1781, but this was then overturned again by the Peace of Paris Treaty in 1783.
Okay, so after 1783, Britain is definitively back in control, and they set about really reshaping the colony in their image.
Exactly. They worked to implement what the source calls a more wholesome British mode. So an Anglican church was built, British schools were set up to promote education for white boys, they established a public library, a newspaper. Even tea drinking became popular among the elite.
A definite cultural shift away from the French period.
Yeah, very clear. The French language diminished. The British plantation model, heavily focused on sugar production and rum consumption, became dominant. Crops grown included indigo, coffee, rum, cotton, sugar, and importantly, nutmeg, which became increasingly significant over time.
And within all this, the source describes a really rigid slave society taking shape.
Yes. Rigidly stratified. You had the planters, the overseers, and interestingly, French-speaking white domestic slaves forming the elite. They were seen as distinct from the African slaves and Creoles, who the source says resisted proverbially. By 1790, slavery was just deeply, deeply entrenched within this society, totally dominated by plantation agriculture.
That rigid structure and the sheer scale of the enslaved population really brings us back to the slave trade's massive impact. You mentioned the staggering numbers earlier.
It's absolutely crucial to grasp the scale here. Slavery transformed the entire Caribbean into a major sugar source, right? And this system was built entirely on enslaved labor. Plantations really took off in the 1640s across the islands.
And why African slaves specifically?
Well, the source points out that enslaving the indigenous population just wasn't practical due to disease, mainly, but also because civil wars in South America created demands for labor there, so they turned to Africa.
The human cost must have been immense.
Unimaginable. Between 1550 and 1807, the estimate is 10.6 million enslaved Africans brought to the Americas. Now, the source specifically states that the jurisdiction of what is modern-day Grenada received, wait for it, 477,000 people.
477,000 for an island that size.
Exactly. It's a truly staggering number, and it fundamentally shaped Grenada's demographic, social, and economic future. You can't understand Grenada without understanding that figure.
In the journey itself, the Middle Passage was just horrific.
The source really emphasizes the horrifying conditions. People packed so tightly in the ships they had no space at all. Subjected to regular beatings, disease outbreaks were rampant. The estimate is that maybe 15% died just during the voyage.
And the work on the plantations once they arrived was equally brutal.
Relentlessly brutal.
Yeah.
Sugar production, especially during the grinding season, which could last most of the year, was incredibly dangerous. Heavy machinery, huge fires, boiling vats.
Seems terrifying.
Yeah. Shifts often lasted 18 hours. And even during the owner's holidays, enslaved people were expected to somehow produce their own food supply.
With that level of constant oppression, resistance must have been a constant feature, too.
It absolutely was. Escaping into the mountainous interior was a common form of resistance. This created what were known as maroon communities.
Right, the Maroons.
Yeah. Skilled enslaved people would create their own plots of land up there. Or they'd move between working on the estates and living in these maroon towns in the hills.
How did the planters try and stop this? How did they control people?
Well, the planter governments implemented really strict controls. Curfews, workmasters patrolling the roads, surveillance patches. They even used bloodhounds to track runaways.
Did it work? Could they catch the Maroons?
Apparently not very effectively. The source notes that catching the Maroons was considered impossible.
Yeah.
And that fact significantly undermined the planters' confidence and their sense of control.
So these Maroon communities were quite significant.
Definitely. Because the population on the plantations was so dense, there were many Maroon communities across the island. And they weren't just places of refuge. They would actively raid plantations for supplies, yes, but also to protect their own people.
Did they have an economic impact?
A real one. At their height around the 1780s, the source suggests the Maroons could produce something like 500,000 pounds worth of sugar. Now, that figure fell later, but it just shows their significant presence and the impact of this resistant population.
So the fight for freedom, that resistance, it was woven right into the fabric of the system itself. Which brings us towards the abolition of slavery. What did Grenadian society look like right before abolition?
The source gives us a really telling population breakdown from the mid-1830s. Out of about 26,173 total people, roughly 22,948 were enslaved Africans.
That's nearly 80%.
Almost exactly 80% of the population. Then you had about 2,614 mulattoes, which included free people of color, and only around 31,608 whites, landowners, shopkeepers, clerks. That nearly 80% figure just starkly illustrates the scale, doesn't it? And the tiny minority holding all the power.
And this huge enslaved workforce was powering the entire economy.
Completely. Laboring mainly in plantation agriculture. Sugarcane was central, of course, but also cocoa that had been grown since 1740, and nutmeg. Nutmeg was introduced after a big hurricane around 1780.
Ah, nutmeg again.
Yes, it became really important, especially for the hilly interior, and it helped the economy quite a bit. Enslaved people worked on, the source says, 128 sugar plantations and 598 other estates combined. Hundreds of properties relying on their labor.
We touched on the free people of color under French rule. How did their situation evolve as abolition approached under the British?
Well, the source notes that free people of color, or mulattoes, had flourished for years under the French, and initially continued to do reasonably well, building homes, businesses. But their opportunities started to decline significantly. Why? Because white planters, increasingly fearful of the power of the black majority and the constant threat of revolt, ramped up efforts to disenfranchise the mulattoes. So that racial anxiety directly impacted the free-colored population's standing and rights.
Did the mulattoes themselves play a role in pushing for abolition?
Yes, they absolutely did. Both enslaved and free mulattoes mobilized. They formed humanitarian groups that provided aid to the enslaved population. And this mobilization, this advocacy, it helped solidify local support for general emancipation. It added significant local pressure to the wider abolition debates happening across the British Empire.
What were their main goals?
Pretty clear, according to the source. 1, make sure local abolition wasn't blocked by the powerful planter interests. 2, gain access to education for both enslaved and free people. And 3, dismantle that discriminatory colored caste system.
Was getting access to education easy?
Far from it. The white plantation class, the planters, they held tight control over the press, local politics, and they fiercely resisted any moves to expand educational access for black or colored people.
Any specific examples of pushback?
The source mentions a local journalist, T.R. Joseph. His inflammatory commentary, as the source puts it, in the Royal Gazette, apparently played a role in shifting public opinion and challenging the planter class on these education issues.
So abolition finally comes in 1834. But the transition, I imagine, wasn't smooth for anyone. What was that post-abolition society like?
Yeah, it was a period of just immense upheaval. The British government faced a huge challenge managing the social transformation after the vast majority of Grenadians were freed. But crucially, their primary objective wasn't really the well-being of the freed people.
What was it then?
Ensuring sugar production continued profitably. That was paramount. Emancipation, from their perspective, absolutely could not be allowed to interfere with the sugar economy.
And what did the formerly enslaved people want? What were their objectives?
Their focus shifted dramatically. From just enduring their condition to actively obtaining time outside the constraints of the estate. The source describes their main challenge as communicating these new needs, these new expectations, to their former managers without provoking their anger, a really complex tightrope walk.
Sounds like a recipe for confusion and conflict.
There's deep uncertainty on all sides. Could the planters, who the source describes as having over-rigid ideas, even adapt? Early attempts involved trying to coax freed people back onto the plantations using 12-month contracts.
Contracts?
Yes, the British insisted on these contracts. They were drafted back in England, supposedly with conditions similar to those previously existing.
Which sounds suspiciously like trying to maintain the old system under a new name.
Exactly. And the effect was precisely that to maintain, not change, the previous power structure. So, unsurprisingly, these contracts weren't readily accepted by the freed people, or even by many estates. The whole system, the source says, came unstuck.
What did that look like on the ground? What happened?
The source describes it as chaos, initially. There was mass movement from estate to estate as freed people looked for the best positions, maybe better hours, or places where duty wasn't demanded quite so immediately.
People voting with their feet, essentially.
In a way, yes. These movements, described as a subdued spectacle when viewed from above, might have looked unspectacular, but they represented massive changes in behavior and expectations.
How so?
Small acts became hugely significant, people replacing mandatory Sunday school, or work with public celebrations when they moved to a new plantation, or just showing up on a Sunday morning with the clear intention of claiming their hutments and their Sabbath ground, their day off. These were quiet, maybe, but powerful assertions of their new freedom and their changed expectations.
That period of adjustment sounds incredibly difficult, but also really foundational for what came next. Okay, let's fast forward into the 20th century. How did Grenada navigate the path towards self-government and eventual independence?
Well, in World War I, Grenada was described as a minor player, though about 500 Grenadians did volunteer for service, and others joined colonial troops. Back home, there were some protests, including from women, against having to work in the sugarcane fields.
And after the war,
The aftermath brought labor unrest across the region, really, as Britain started the slow process of dismantling its colonial empire. Unions fought against the colonial system. By the late 30s, early 40s, you had figures like H.A.C. Pollard leading resistance parties, getting arrested, pushing for the vote for access to higher education. That unrest just kept growing.
did Britain make any concessions at this stage?
Yes, the source mentions concessions were made in 1943. A national convention was organized, and a really key figure emerges here, Dr. Eric Matthew Gary. He won a seat in the Colonial Assembly.
Gary. He becomes absolutely central and often controversial, doesn't he?
Absolutely. The 1951 Constitution introduced some self-government, but Gary apparently had trouble getting it accepted and introduced his own version. Then a new constitution in 1960 was described as tightly controlled, leading to limited elections in 1961.
The source points out something interesting about the population during this time as well.
Yeah, it notes that Grenada's population stayed virtually unchanged compared to neighbors like St. Vincent and Dominica. And it also mentions a growing distance between the existing East Indian and Negro populations on the island.
What was Gary's early political strategy? How did he build his power base?
Well, upon returning to Grenada, he apparently instigated worker strikes on the plantations. The source states these strikes led to bloodshed. In 1951, there were riots all over Grenada, which were put down by British troops flown in from Trinidad. Yeah. Labor leaders, insurgents, including Gary himself, were tried by the British. The economic cost was estimated at £5 million, and the source uses this interesting phrase: 246 planters were brought non-ruin. It also includes a strange mention of reports about Grenadians breaking the French Virgin Islands. Not entirely clear what that refers to, but it's in the text.
And the economy suffered.
Yes. Sugar estates continued, but productivity dropped. The colony fell deeply into debt. Discontent spread to other key crops, like bananas.
So the push for self-government wasn't a sudden thing, it was gradual.
No, definitely gradual. The source highlights it as a movement that really started picking up steam in the late 1940s. Although, confusingly perhaps, that also mentions the first legislative council being established way back in 1843, which adds a longer historical context or maybe reflects different stages of representation.
Was there popular desire for independence by this point?
Oh yes, strong support. The source mentions an anti-colonial march was planned for the day after the British government announced a referendum that would actually deny Grenadians a direct vote on their future constitution. That shows the public demand pretty clearly.
Right.
Under the 1952 Constitution, Grenada became part of the West Indies Federation, but there was widespread opposition. It never really got off the ground effectively, and Grenada just remained a British colony.
And Gary stayed influential.
Yes, his Labour Party comfortably won the 1957 election. After that, the British sent this figure, Robert Joseph described, as white planters' representative and former police officer, to inquire into the Labour Party's conduct. That move was, unsurprisingly, strongly protested by the party.
When did everyone get the right to vote? Universal suffrage.
A really key date is September 22, 1967. That was the first time Grenadians, regardless of property ownership, could vote for their representatives. Gary's ruling Labour Party won 4 seats. The opposition PLP got 2. This really paved the way for the first proper step towards self-government, with a new constitution coming into operation in 1968.
What were the next steps towards full independence?
Well, there were grants and loans for the first cohort of Grenadian public servants. An independent committee was appointed to look at future constitutional advancement. Grenada participated in Caribbean conferences. Recommendations came from various reports. Parliament adopted resolutions supporting independence, and election results solidified that move.
And independence finally arrived in 1974.
Yes, February 7th. Though the source uses this slightly unusual phrasing, the 2nd of February and the 4th of March, 1974, noting it happened at the same time as the rest of the British West Indies. a bit specific on the dates there.
What kind of government did they set up?
The new constitution was based on the British Westminster model. So you had an appointed upper Senate, an elected lower House of Representatives, and an executive cabinet drawn from those elected members.
Was the transition peaceful, smooth?
Grenada and other Caribbean islands gaining independence around then, they expected a smooth transition. But, the source points out, the recent memories of violent unrest during Guyana's independence were still fresh and chilling. So there's an underlying anxiety.
And Eric Matthew Gerry became the first political leader with a really substantial popular following. What more does the source tell us about his rise?
Oh, he was born around 1922, St. Andrew Parish, to sharecropper parents. Considered bright, started out as a teacher. The source notes he secretly formed a teachers' union. That built support among public servants, fisherfolk. And he expanded this into a broader movement rooted in the fishing sector. Made overtures to the wider trade union movement, too, at Clifton Beach.
What was his political style like in those early days?
At that stage, the source says he wasn't really pushing a specific political theory. He was just seen as a reasonably competent orator. He got his first political win in a local election to the General Council of the Grenada and Carriacou Cooperative Society, Ltd.
And his movement grew beyond just unions.
Yes. The movement he started morphed into the Grenco Union Federation. The source highlights that this federation was very aware of the potential consequences of political power. They sought legitimacy through voters, scrutinized votes carefully, something his opponents apparently found, quote, anathema.
So opposition was there from the start.
Oh, yeah. The source notes his opponents, described as perennial, capitalized on popular resentment towards some of Gerry's outbursts. They used, and I quote, big money behind sensible television attacks and drawn-out court litigation to challenge him constantly.
This political friction, it really set the stage for the turbulent 1970s and the 1979 revolution, didn't it?
Absolutely. The New Jewel movement, the NJM, emerged as this really significant popular social and political force in the 1970s. The force describes it as laying the foundation for a seismic shift in Caribbean geopolitics in the 80s. And the overthrow of Gerry's regime in '79 is characterized as a popular uprising.
What was the impact of that revolution? What changed?
It profoundly affected Grenadian society's evolution. It reshaped its relationships with regional powers, world powers, and definitely impacted the American presence and influence in the Caribbean.
What about Gerry's regime in the lead up to '79? How was it behaving?
After independence, the Gerry government consolidated more and more power, often using tactics, the source says, to neutralize opponents. However, the argument in the text is that these tactics just weren't sustainable, especially facing an economic crisis, growing opposition resistance, and just widespread popular disillusionment with the regime's ability to actually deliver improvements for people.
So the fall of the regime created an opening.
Exactly. It allowed the popular movement, the NJM, to really step in and pursue its own ambitions.
Where did the NJM actually come from? What were its origins?
It emerged back in the late 1960s. Started as an umbrella coalition of various youth groups. But the source points out, initially, it faced deep internal divisions, ideological, generational, class differences, personality clashes, all sorts of things. This apparently hindered its ability to formulate a clear, unified revolutionary program early on.
So it wasn't immediately a cohesive force?
No. Like Gerry earlier, the NJM started the 1970s as an undeclared party on the margins of the political system.
How did the opposition, including the NJM, actually challenge Gerry's government on the ground?
The official opposition, various dissident groups, they organized protests in the streets of St. George's. They worked hard to rally popular support against the regime. The government initially tried to sort of diffuse these tensions.
What was the final trigger, then, for the revolution itself?
The source suggests it was a combination of things. Gerry leaving for the UN General Assembly, combined with increasing internal pressure, external pressure. It all signaled the regime's end was near.
And after the overthrow?
There was a period of relative calm, actually. The popular movement published a 10-point program for reconstruction in July 1979. A transitional government was established, formalizing a de facto government that had kind of taken shape after a political purge back in December 1978.
But the new government faced challenges.
Oh, daunting challenges.
Yeah.
Dismantling Gerry's repressive state apparatus was incredibly difficult. It was inseparable from the state itself. Implementing rapid change created operational uncertainties. And this, source says, tempted opponents and recruited agents of destabilization.
And these internal tensions and external pressures eventually escalated, leading to the highly controversial 1983 U.S. intervention.
Yes, a U.S.-led invasion was launched in October 1983. The immediate context, the trigger, was the overthrow and execution of the Prime Minister, Maurice Bishop, by a rival leftist faction within the New Jewel movement itself.
What was the stated purpose from the perspective of the U.S. and its allies?
The U.S., along with 6 Caribbean nations who joined them, stated their goal was to restore a more pro-Western regime in Grenada.
And the international reaction? What did other countries think?
Widespread condemnation. From regional organizations, from the United Nations. The source particularly highlights that many saw it as demonstrating a really dangerous precedent for extracontinental intervention in the Caribbean.
Why dangerous?
The argument was it fostered instability, undermined the rule of law, and basically opened the door for more outside interference in the region's affairs.
The source connects this to broader U.S. policy aims.
Yes, the text describes this as a watershed moment for U.S. intervention policy. It links it to wider aims, including what it refers to as George W. Bush's Suffering Democracy campaign.
Yeah.
Apparently, this was articulated, the source says, as a complaint by Antiguans lamenting Bishop's fall.
Right.
Grenada's fate, the source argues, became tied to the domino principle of the Cold War. Bishop's regime, with its embrace of regional integration, took on a significant ideological dimension in that context.
So the Grenadian Revolution was seen as a direct threat to the U.S.
By late 1982, the source suggests yes. The perception was that the revolution was continuing to ineluctably shake the foundations on which the U.S. social order rested. This led to growing expectations, apparently, for a U.S. military response. Bishop's assassination during that internal power struggle then brought, the source adds, disappointments and fears of a direct bilateral confrontation.
And the justification for the intervention itself, according to this particular source.
Well, the source attributes the decision, from one perspective presented in the text, to perceived weaknesses in U.S. intelligence capabilities and the apparent failure of non-military options. This led to a perceived need for military action to restore the credibility of U.S. power globally.
The source also talks about wider global implications.
It does. It argues the Grenadian tragedy had global reverberations. Following setbacks for the U.S. elsewhere in Lebanon, Iran, the U.S. was reportedly looking to regain credibility as a world power.
And the source offers a strong interpretation of the event.
Yes, it's quite pointed. The interpretation presented is that the invasion heralded the American restoration and the sacrifice of a third world nation. It raised critical questions, the source says, about the future of nations unwilling to align with U.S. power, and highlighted what the text describes as the bias of American intervention. It's really important we stress this is one specific perspective offered by the text we're working from.
Understood. A powerful, specific interpretation from our source material. Okay, what was the aftermath like? What happened during the recovery after the intervention?
Right, the invasion was October 25th, 1983. Stated purpose? Overthrow the Marxist regime, establish a pro-U.S. government, respond to perceived threats from Grenada's ties to Cuba and the Soviet Union. Militarily, U.S. forces quickly defeated the Grenadian army and captured key leaders.
What happened to the government structure then?
A new cabinet was formed pretty quickly. Nicholas Brathwaite was appointed prime minister, Michael Bullen as foreign minister. And political parties, which had been banned for 4 years during the revolutionary period, were allowed to return.
What was the impact on the island itself, physically and socially?
Thousands of U.S. and Caribbean troops arrived. The aim was partly physical safety, partly restoring the economy. But many buildings were demolished in the fighting, infrastructure was severely crippled, and the intervention definitely generated a wave of popular anti-U.S. sentiment across the Caribbean region.
The source says Grenada was slowly reborn into a peaceful nation. But were there ongoing challenges during that recovery?
Oh, yes. Despite U.S. aid and goodwill, the source notes that obvious threats to security remained. The economy was left in shambles. And political terrorism apparently reached staggering levels. Former leaders of the revolution, like former Security Chief Nelson, faced brutal execution.
And Prime Minister Bishop himself.
His fate is described in grim detail, falling to what the source calls a trial by kangaroo court, aerial assault, summary execution, or maybe even secret assassination. The details remain murky, but the outcome was brutal.
Was there any kind of memorial?
Yes. A memorial was put up in 1985 at the site of Bishop's assassination. It had a plaque with a stone dove of peace, which at least one international newspaper apparently described as dripping blood.
Wow.
Yeah. And tragically, the source notes, even on this memorial site, the revolution's ideals of peace and brotherhood were undermined by sentiments quoted like, "Who wants peace? Let the Labour Party come. Ta-ta, Grendel." The source concludes this whole section very starkly, just saying the New Jewel movement was buried.
A chilling end to that chapter.
Yeah.
Okay, moving into the 1990s, the political landscape continued to change significantly, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Influenced by local events, but also the wider international context, the end of the Cold War, for instance. The course makes an interesting point here. Because Grenada is so small, its political developments can actually have a disproportionately transformative effect on the entire Caribbean region.
How did external influences play a role during this period?
Well, its history has always been shaped by transnational forces, religious, political, social, cultural, leading to a sort of hybridization of influences. But the source also stresses the effectiveness of local political actions, what he calls eventual politics, in driving change, leading to specific victories and defeats right there on the island.
Did the focus of politics change after independence and the revolution?
Yeah, the source suggests that post-independence, Grenadian politics became more focused nationally and regionally. It lost some of that earlier, broader transnational dimension, a trend apparently seen in other similar Caribbean countries, the net exporters.
Who was actually in charge during the 90s? Which parties were dominant?
In 1990, the new national party, the NNP, led by Keith Mitchell, was elected. However, the source states that Mitchell and other state officials soon became entangled in internal corruption scandals, even extrajudicial execution scandals.
And this led to significant domestic unrest. People weren't happy.
It certainly did. Continued domestic discontent contributed to an event the source refers to quite dramatically as a coup involving significant destruction reportedly carried out by a public figure named Peter David. Members of Mitchell's cabinet were apparently filmed in the state described as frail and debased.
But despite these major scandals, the NNP managed to survive politically.
Yes, their party machinery, the source says, remained intact. In the 1995 election, the source notes that an act of revulsion by the public, presumably against the NNP, was somehow trumped by the election victory of the GLP leader, Waters. Some former GOP cabinet members returned.
So Mitchell lost in 95.
Narrowly, yes. But he returned to power just a few years later, in November 1999.
Were there other major events impacting the government during Mitchell's later time in office?
Later on, yes. The extreme devastation caused by Hurricane Ivan in 2004 and what the source calls the deplorable state of the public sector during the recovery years significantly impacted Mitchell's government. The perception, according to the source, was that the government was ignoring the plight of vulnerable Grenadians during this incredibly difficult time.
That sounds like it would fuel even more political instability.
It did. The source notes that vigilante politics caught on. You had parades against state and police actions, raucous calls for protest and detention, accusations flying around about government violence. However, the source does conclude this section by suggesting that towards the end of the century, this kind of overt violence and agential politics seem to have mostly been put aside, at least for a time.
Moving beyond the strictly political challenges, the 1990s and early 2000s were also a really tough time for Grenada's economy, weren't they?
Incredibly tough. The source attributes these challenges mainly to external shocks, global events, but also issues with governance. An oil price increase back in 1990 severely impacted the economy, caused something like a 10% contraction.
Wow.
Then an international recession led to a huge drop in tourism, 60% fewer visitors, and a decline in hotel accommodation.
And then came Hurricane Ivan.
Exactly. Hurricane Ivan in 2004 was just devastating. Destroyed 90% of the housing stock, wiped out all agricultural crops. The source describes this as leading to the poorest economic performance ever recorded for Grenada.
That level of destruction is almost hard to imagine. What did this do to the government's finances?
It pushed them to the brink. The island faced rapidly declining fiscal and external balances. They had to seek assistance. The source points to factors like an above-average rate of government borrowing, political patronage, and corruption as widening these financial gaps even before Ivan hit.
Were there any attempts to fix the financial situation before it became critical?
Yes. Before the near economic collapse around 2000-2001, the government did work on economic stabilization and transformation. They even requested technical assistance for their financial statements. They agreed to a two-part fiscal policy reform, starting with short-term stabilization measures, aiming for a full-scale fiscal, monetary, and structural reform program later.
What was the goal of those reforms? What were they trying to achieve?
The policy aimed for a mix of things. Quick revenue measures, cuts in expenditure, structural reforms, all designed to achieve high, sustained economic growth, create jobs, boost tax revenue, and generate a balance of payment surplus. That was the plan anyway.
But the economy continued to struggle. The reforms didn't work immediately.
No. The source states that after 2 years of political turmoil and that near collapse of the financial sector, the economy actually contracted further. Real GDP shrank by 6.0% in 2001 and another 3.5% in 2002.
And a government deficit.
Ballooned. It hit 12.4% of GDP, driven by spending responses to the crises and just eroded tax revenues. The primary deficit was also extremely high, around 9.5%. The source highlights a real lack of budgetary restraint on current spending. The government wage bill alone consumed 60% of revenues in 2002.
And all of this contributed to a major debt crisis.
Precisely. The debt-to-GDP ratio just shot up incredibly rapidly, from under 40% in 1995 to over 125% by 2002. This basically rendered the public sector insolvent and made substantial debt restructuring and deep spending cuts absolutely necessary. There's no other choice.
Natural disasters, particularly hurricanes like Ivan, are clearly a recurring, devastating challenge for Grenada.
They are an inescapable part of reality there. While Grenada is celebrated for its beauty, its spices, beaches, culture, the source describes its reality as also being ungracious. It's right in the Atlantic hurricane belt, described starkly as doomed to hurricanes and heat waves.
That's a harsh description.
It is. The source elaborates. The very tranquility and warmth that attract tourists also, tragically, lure Caribbean sea-swirling storms, winds, and waves of death.
And Hurricane Ivan in 2004 was just catastrophic, as you said.
The source really details the immense destruction. Infrastructure shattered. Locally owned businesses annihilated, the international port, the airport, all the major hotels knocked out of commission. Hundreds of homes destroyed, thousands left homeless, leading to real fears of civil unrest, looting. People sought refuge wherever they could, schools, churches, even the Prime Minister's offices.
Yet the source also speaks to the remarkable resilience of the Grenadian people in the face of this.
It offers a really striking image. Apparently, for a visitor passing through just 1 month after Ivan hit, there was little evidence left of the massive hurricane's immediate impact.
Really? Only a month later?
Yeah. The visible wreckage was gone. Vacant lots looked normal again. Cars were parked. Merchants were back selling things on the streets. It's a powerful snapshot, isn't it, of a community immediately starting that incredibly arduous task of rebuilding.
It really is. Given the island's natural beauty and that constant need for economic revitalization, tourism must play an absolutely crucial role in Grenada's economy today.
It certainly does. Though the source notes, interestingly, that despite its rich history, Grenada was relatively late in developing its tourism infrastructure and direct promotion compared to neighbors like Barbados or St. Lucia.
So, not much research or writing specifically on Grenadian tourism.
Apparently, few publications focused specifically on it. Others might refer to it, maybe ecotourism policy, specific products. It mentions a description, Isle of Spice, Isle of Grandeur, Isle of Greatness. Hospitality journals cover it. But a lack of really comprehensive analysis seems to be the point.
When did the government start actively focusing on tourism development?
After independence in 1974, tourism development became a government priority. Hotels, accommodation, they were designated as key projects in the 1974-1980 development plan. And a longer-term framework was prepared in 1976.
Was there a period of significant growth before all the turmoil in the 80s?
Yes, it seems so. In 1978, the government actually announced a tourism boom. Significant numbers of passengers arriving weekly by charter from the UK, other services starting up, like 747s from the eastern USA.
That must have strained the infrastructure.
It did. The increased passenger volume apparently began to strain the existing airport terminals at Point Salines, leading to proposals for a $3.5 million expansion.
How did the political events of the early 80s, the revolution, the intervention, impact this growing industry?
The source states bluntly, the sector came to a halt with the U.S. military intervention in 1983. Reestablishing it afterwards was really challenging. Struggles with hotel inventories, needing to reinstate FAA certification for the airport, sorting out land inventory for U.S. Air, lots of practical problems.
When did tourism begin to properly pick up again?
It took off again, spurred by additional air service coming in from the eastern USA in the late 1980s. The source mentions, maybe a bit critically, Grenada accepting what it describes as Eastern Airlines dumping tourists onto local markets, which apparently fueled growth.
So there was another boom.
Yes. 1988 saw what the source calls an explosion in tourism. Increases in airline seats, visitor arrivals, new hotels, guest houses popping up. Air passenger movements increased by 17% annually.
But was that sustainable?
Apparently not. That growth was short-lived. Arrivals fell dramatically in early 1989, possibly due to sharp capacity cuts by Eastern Airlines and also the local carrier, CLM Air. So volatile.
How does the tourism picture look now in the 21st century, according to the source?
The source states that the island's endowment in tourism blossomed into an already lucrative industry. Grenada is now considered among the top ranks of Caribbean destinations, gives a high factor score of 22.5 out of 100, whatever that signifies. Infrastructure has been upgraded, airport remodeled, expanded, new hotels built.
Who is the tourism sector primarily targeting now? Which visitors?
Hotels seem to cater principally to U.S. visitors, often with all-inclusive packages. The source lists examples: Palm Mountain Beach Resort, Spice Island Beach Resort, Sandals La Source. The government actively promotes Grenada as the spice of the Caribbean. You have iconic symbols like the Moses statue commemorating the nutmeg trade and independence. And the source also suggests that trade and travel liberalization after 9/11 increased Grenada's attractiveness as a destination.
That blend of indigenous, African, and European influences we've discussed throughout must have created an incredibly rich and unique cultural heritage.
It absolutely has. Grenada's culture is just this vibrant reflection of its layered history, its diverse traditions, and the creativity of its people. Indigenous peoples, African slaves, European colonizers, they all contributed, forging this really unique blend you don't find anywhere else.
And Carnival, or Spicemas, as it's called there, sounds like the absolute centerpiece of this culture.
It's definitely described as the most vibrant and popular public celebration. Believed to have origins maybe in 16th century France, Grenada's Carnival is said to be the most colorful and finest in the Caribbean. High praise.
When exactly is it celebrated? The source seemed a little unclear earlier.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of contradiction within the text itself. It clearly states that Carnival was legislatively moved from the traditional pre-Lenten period to August back in 1990.
Okay.
But then later on, it also says the main Carnival days are the Monday and Tuesday immediately before Ash Wednesday. So depending on which sentence you read in the source, you get conflicting information on the timing of the main event.
Okay. Well, acknowledging that slight confusion in the source itself, what is the actual Carnival experience like? What happens?
It's described as just a fantastic, festive, unforgettable experience. Lots of parties, events leading up to the main celebration. Music and participation in the parades are key, seen as uniting people, celebrating humanity.
What kind of music?
You get steel band, soca, calypso, groovy soca. The repertoire has expanded over time. Revelers join mass bands, masquerade bands parading through the streets of St. George's in all sorts of amazing costumes. The grand parade goes on late into the evening with street dancers, bands, DJs, musicians. Just a huge celebration.
What about Independence Day? How is that marked?
That's celebrated on February 7th. It marks the restoration of independence in 1974, and it's a public holiday. Interestingly, the source notes that prior to independence, February 7th was actually known as Causeway Day, commemorating the opening of the causeway linking Grenada and Carriacou.
Ah, interesting detail.
Yeah. The source mentions other public holidays and festivals, too, of historical or cultural significance, drawing from indigenous, African, Caribbean origins. But Spicemas really remains the most notable. It also marks the emancipation from slavery and traditionally opens with a big pre-Spicemas fete music, food, dancing.
Okay, turning now towards social development. The source highlighted some pretty significant challenges earlier, particularly regarding education, especially after independence.
Yes, it really points to a significant deficiency and what it calls near total neglect of formal education during the first 28 years of independence, which is a strong statement.
But Grenada wasn't historically barred from education under the British.
No, not excluded or barred, but there was a decline post-1960, apparently made worse by an exodus of teachers and students leaving the island.
Why were teachers and students leaving? What were they seeking?
Students were mainly seeking access to post-secondary education, which required English language competence, certain levels of mathematical and scientific education, skills that, according to the source, Grenadian upper secondary schools just couldn't adequately provide anymore at that time.
That sounds like a crisis.
It was perceived as such. At one point, the governor apparently desperately proposed Grenada's immediate reassimilation into the West Indian Federation, seeing it as the only entity capable of addressing these dire educational needs. There was also a 1964 commission, an expatriate British one, urging integration into the British Caribbean and proposing an era of universal primary education with major external assistance.
Did independence in 1974 bring about this universal primary education then?
Yes, but the source described the immediate effect as universal primary education on a cataclysmic scale, calls it an astonishment. Suddenly, you had thousands of people with no formal education experience tasked with teaching children who had, until then, been illiterate.
That sounds incredibly challenging to implement.
Hugely. These children were streamed into classes described as absurdly disequilibrated, very unevenly balanced. Sometimes they were even denied admission entirely due to village population size or demographic reasons. Primary schools became severely overcrowded. Chaos, basically.
How was this dramatic shift perceived by the population?
Well, the source notes an interesting shift in perception. Formal education, once seen primarily as a European enterprise, was now becoming the property of the descendants of enslaved Africans. But by exercising this new entitlement to all that was free, the source argues, Grenadians somehow rendered the mission impotent. It's a complex, perhaps controversial interpretation in the text.
What were the consequences of this chaotic implementation?
Pretty severe, according to the source. Primary school provisions were effectively consumed by the mulatto and mixed-race French populations, suggesting unequal access. Crime and juvenile delinquency became commonplace. A high proportion of the primary school population simply ceased to exist, a stark phrase likely indicating many children just stopped attending school altogether. And schools were among the first buildings vandalized during periods of unrest.
Was there any accountability for this situation?
The source is quite blunt here, stating there was a lack of accountability, citing unpunished teachers and prime ministers. Reversing these trends proved very difficult, partly because universal primary education was viewed more as a grievous one-off reaction against past evils, rather than a sustained, planned quest for educational improvement.
Did things get worse before they got better?
The situation was apparently worsened by what the source calls clinical but utterly unqualified teachers, being brought in via dubious work permits, which just compounded things. However, the section does end on a slightly more hopeful note, stating Grenada's education would not be thus doomed, implying that later efforts were made to improve the system, even if the source doesn't detail them right here.
It certainly sounds like a deeply challenging period for social progress. How has Grenada navigated the international stage since then, particularly as a small island developing state, SA?
Well, for most Incyanides, international relations are absolutely vital. They place a high premium on them to enhance both security and development. Post-independence, Grenada actively established diplomatic relations globally: Western Hemisphere, Europe, Africa, Asia. They created a foreign ministry, a diplomatic service.
And we know from earlier discussion it became a real focal point during the Cold War.
Yes, absolutely. Grenada became a key point of tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The source describes the 1979 coup as an extreme and misguided attempt at modernization. That's its phrasing, which immediately made the island and its new leadership a target of concern within the Caribbean community and internationally.
How did other countries react to the revolutionary government?
Externally, the U.S. and some other countries reduced or completely cut back assistance. International agencies became wary. Grenada was often depicted, the source says, as a threat to regional democracy and security.
Did Grenada perceive external threats to its own sovereignty during this time?
Yes, the source states that Grenada recognized and reciprocated efforts to undermine its sovereignty and actively attacked aggressors. It gives specific examples like perceived hostile actions by the Vincentian prime minister, who apparently allowed anti-Grenadian radio broadcasts from their airspace. Grenada also rejected calls from anti-Cuban factions to cooperate in blockading Cuba, viewing that as a clear violation of its sovereignty.
What about positive international engagement? Was Grenada involved in regional bodies?
Yes, definitely. Grenada actively participated. It joined the Caribbean Commission, the Caribbean Development Bank, CDB, attended meetings like the Central American Policy Council, was involved in discussions for a pan-Caribbean agency for trade and development, and even before independence, it had received aid grants from both the U.S. and Britain. The source notes that relations with major international bodies, the UN and its agencies, the Commonwealth, CARICOM, the OAS, continue to be important for improving Grenada's international standing.
Okay, so shifting focus a bit. Grenada is blessed with incredible natural beauty, as we've said, but it must also face significant environmental challenges.
It really does. It has tremendous natural beauty and biodiversity: that mountainous terrain, rainforests, valleys, waterfalls, rivers, coral reefs, beaches. Grenadians are deeply proud of their natural resources, especially the sea and marine life.
But this beautiful environment is also fragile, vulnerable.
Very much so. Development pressures are a major issue. The need for land, for housing, for commercial use leads to problems like hill cutting, filling in marshland.
Which causes knock-on effects.
Exactly. Soil erosion, deteriorating water quality, deforestation, and just clearing bush increases the loss of topsoil and biodiversity.
Any specific habitats under threat?
There's particular alarm about the loss of mangroves. They're critical for coastal replenishment, for protecting fisheries, enhancing fish stocks. Sand mining and quarrying for construction materials also cause problems, loss of natural stone, exposing the shoreline to increased wave action, sedimentation in the water, which affects fish populations and their reproduction.
And this must impact tourism, too.
Yes, development happening too close to pristine natural spots causes a loss of attraction value, as the source puts it. Hurts the very thing that draws visitors.
What about the marine environment specifically? What are the key features and threats?
It's very rich, very diverse, plays a central role in Grenadian culture, lifestyle, the economy. The source notes 2 large seagrass beds, 2 major coral reef areas that sustain the traditional fishery. Commercial catches recorded at local park show significant amounts of grouper and conch being landed.
Is overfishing a concern?
Yes, it's highlighted as a major concern, largely due to current development pressures. It's threatening fish stocks for future generations. The source gives a specific, quite worrying instance. Fish stocks in St. George's Bay being destroyed by a local hotel. It warns this fate threatens other fishing grounds, especially those near newly licensed hotels.
Does Grenada have a plan, a policy to protect its environment?
It does have a conservation policy,
Yeah.
described in the source as simple, thorough, and realistic. Its main pillars are 1. Strict protection of designated areas and resources. 2. Limited development allowed in surrounding areas. And 3. Emphasizing education is absolutely key to conservation success.
But are they able to implement it effectively?
That's the challenge. As the source points out that a lack of funds and training significantly hampers the government's ability to fully implement this policy and the related environmental legislation. Good intentions, difficult execution.
Okay. Turning now to health and the healthcare system. What's the situation like on the island in that area?
Well, Grenada has apparently made significant strides in healthcare since independence. The protection of citizens' health is actually enshrined as a state right and duty in the Constitution.
Was there a specific policy driving improvements?
A national health policy introduced back in the early 1980s aimed to provide free, primary and secondary care for all citizens, with a strong emphasis on preventive care.
Has the system faced challenges or pressure for change, like privatization?
Yes, it's been subjected to pressure for reform, but the source notes it has successfully resisted privatization measures so far, and it's managed to maintain what the source calls a fairly efficient public health system.
Do they have social health insurance, like a national scheme?
Yes, and Grenada is highlighted as one of the few Caribbean countries with a complete social health insurance scheme. It covers nearly all public sector employees, supported by government grants and donor funding.
Is there a private healthcare sector alongside the public one?
Yes. There's a range of private services available, private hospitals, clinics, labs, pharmacies, which complement the public system. And these services are also used by patients coming over from nearby islands like the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent.
What are the current challenges facing the healthcare system, according to the source?
Achieving truly universal coverage still needs more financial resources. The system also needs to better reactivate its engagement with a broader development agenda, connect health to other sectors.
Financial issues.
The source suggests that addressing unnecessary spending, particularly on specialist services, could help avert financial difficulties. There's also a need for a more concerted approach to health promotion and prevention, moving away from an over-reliance on just curative services and what the source terms obsolescent technologies.
What about governance of the system?
Improvements suggested include hospital trusts, allowing board members more engagement with the local community. Public health agencies need expanded communication capacity, need to build alliances with other sectors. The source also notes that rapid, unplanned expansion of specialist services in the past gave an impression of development being on track. But decisions on hospital expansion were often taken without proper planning, sometimes just because specialists wanted to work there.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about something that often unites a nation and generates a lot of pride. Sports.
Yes. Grenada apparently has a rich sporting tradition, covering both competitive sports and more leisure-based pursuits. Its varied geography allows for squash, cricket, basketball, football, track and field, swimming. a bit of everything.
What are the most popular sports? What do people follow most keenly?
Cricket is the national sport, and the most popular, closely followed by football. Matches apparently generate really passionate crowds. And on weekends, you'll find lots of people enjoying aquatic activities on the beaches: swimming, sailing, jet skiing, windsurfing, snorkeling. Grenada even hosts world-class triathlons.
Cricket sounds particularly significant.
It really is, described as having a hardball dominant role. You see daily training happening on beaches, in parks. Grenada has hosted international test matches, West Indies versus England, for example. And Grenadian cricketers have represented the West Indies team, gained acclaim in the Caribbean Premier League.
What about women's cricket?
Also notable. There are prominent women cricketers, and the source mentions one received a national award for her contributions, the first woman to do so.
The source has some really specific, quite evocative descriptions of how national pride is tied to individual athletes, doesn't it?
It really does. It suggests national pride there is more than just an impressive medal count. Many prominent athletes apparently often train largely on their own, not always as part of highly organized teams.
It mentions specific examples.
Yes, it talks about a specific shot putter, long jumper, and discus thrower, often seen training with just her coach, considered a national jewel. Her discovery, the source reports, was apparently linked to an unusual aqueous phenomenon, whatever that means, and she effectively adopted both the sport and her country.
And there's a sprinter mentioned whose status is even higher.
Yes, the source describes a sprinter whose stature is even loftier. The entire nation has huge expectations whenever he competes. His status borders on godliness. People, even in remote areas, praise him with a distinct Grenadian flavor. And Grenadians, the source says, can't help but bask in the glory of his country-like achievements on the international stage. It really highlights how deeply individual sporting success is felt as a point of collective national pride.
That paints a really vivid picture. Okay, finally, let's talk about the role of the diaspora. That's often crucial for islands like Grenada.
Absolutely. It's described flat out as an essential element of Grenadian history and identity. Like many people from the Caribbean, Grenadians have migrated over generations for all sorts of reasons.
Such as?
Escaping slavery or oppressive labor conditions, seeking education, seeking economic opportunity, responding to political crises, environmental crises like hurricanes, the whole range.
So the Grenadian diaspora is part of that much wider Caribbean global community.
Exactly. It's an extensive, diverse global community.
Yeah.
Descendants of enslaved Africans, indentured laborers, even colonial administrators form parts of it. And the source emphasizes the significant role this diaspora has played in nation building, not just for Grenada, but for other territories too.
How does the diaspora engage with the homeland, politically speaking?
Their political engagement and contributions have often been really compelling, involved in movements for freedom, reparations, human rights issues, relief efforts like after the Haiti earthquake. The source notes that the tumultuous events of 1983, the U.S. invasion, the assassinations particularly highlighted the tension that can exist between the state and the diaspora, and it stirred up radical activism within the diaspora community at that time.
Are there formal organizations?
Yes, Grenadian organizations based in the diaspora are important. They help maintain connections, promote exchange visits. There's a view presented that the diaspora and the homeland are integrally linked, partly because of that history of voluntary exile, but also a continued strong desire for belonging among diaspora members.
Is the diaspora a single, unified group, though? Does everyone think the same way?
No, the source explicitly states it is neither monolithic nor homogeneous. Diasporic societies, organizations, individuals, they engage with the homeland in really varied ways, influenced by their circumstances abroad, influenced by the power dynamics within Grenada itself.
So there can be divisions.
Definitely. Internal tensions, divisions within the diaspora based on gender, class, national origins, political associations, all that exists. Countries with long histories of migration, like Grenada, face ongoing challenges in confronting potential fragmentation and deepening divides within their diaspora populations.
What's the takeaway here?
The political impact of these transnational relations, of national identity, how migratory experiences are constructed and understood, it's all critically important. The source notes that the motivations behind collective behavior among the Grenadian diaspora actually warrant further study. There's more to understand there.
Okay, that brings us right up to the present and the challenges Grenada faces looking ahead. as outlined in the source material we have.
Yeah, the current or a new government, whenever this was written, faces what the source calls an impressive array of challenges. There's a clear need for intervention programs, strategies to revitalize, reorient the economy, improve the limited income opportunities available to many.
What are the underlying strengths the island can build on?
Well, the source highlights the island is full of skilled people. Their focus just needs realignment, it suggests. The main strength, it says, lies in the labor and the spirit of the people. And fundamentally, work needs workforce in order to develop.
What about economic challenges specific to being a small island?
One key challenge is that small, isolated countries inevitably import raw products more than larger nations do. And import tariffs, duties, they need careful revision so they don't end up hurting local growers and manufacturers inadvertently.
And implementation, actually getting things done, seems to be a persistent issue, according to the source.
Yes, the source identifies implementation as often the weakest link. Primarily, it says, due to poor planning and structuring. When too many people are assigned overlapping duties, the result is often that none get done effectively, or you get conflicting work happening.
What does the source suggest is needed to improve that? Better implementation?
It suggests fairly practical things. Individual accountability, clear job descriptions, identifying specific subordinates for tasks. It also notes that maybe not all existing mechanisms or organizations are suitable for driving change effectively.
So new approaches might be needed.
Yeah, cultivating alliances is seen as crucial, especially where planning and strategies are non-taxable or free, perhaps meaning leveraging nonprofit or community efforts. Sector-based councils and cooperatives are suggested as a potentially sound strategy.
The source also mentions some perhaps unhelpful tendencies.
It does. A tendency to take individual credit and ignore collective effort, and a tendency for individuals or groups to try and take final charge or sort of wrestle away control and funding from initiatives. It suggests that moving towards a more collective view with transparent, open record-keeping would help lessen this discomfort and maybe foster more collaboration.
And changing these ingrained practices, these tendencies, that takes time, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. Change is described as potentially painfully slow. The source really stresses the need for open discussion, negotiation with the people about new approaches, actively welcoming opposing views, rather than just denying or suppressing them.
The education system was highlighted earlier as needing significant improvement. Does the source revisit that?
It does, briefly reiterating that the school system requires an overhaul. It calls for systems of internal and external assessment for all grades to gauge both student progress and the performance of the system more broadly.
What about the role of teachers in this?
Teachers are seen as absolutely critical to assessment, described as the first and foremost architects of knowledge. However, the source argues the government has to be the one to specify the standards against which teachers are judged. It can't just let them construct their own standards independently. It needs clear direction from the top.
Okay, so considering this incredibly complex history and all these ongoing challenges, what does the source ultimately say about Grenada's future prospects in the 21st century? What's the outlook?
It anticipates, perhaps somewhat pessimistically, a probable permanence of contemporary sociopolitical features, meaning the patterns we see now might stick around.
Such as?
The left-leaning ideological and structural legacy of the revolution continuing to contrast with a more moderate right-leaning ethos in society. The source predicts the politicized hostility of the entrenched left is likely to persist. It actually suggests an overwhelming probability of political conflict in the foreseeable future.
That's a strong prediction. And the potential consequences of that predicted conflict?
Grassroots public discontent, heightened fragility in the political order, in governance generally. And on the economic side, socioeconomic external vulnerability, structural disadvantage. Those are also seen as likely to persist. The major enemies identified way back around independence.
What were they again?
Large-scale agricultural price shocks, climatic instability like hurricanes, the constraints imposed by the externalization of plantation agriculture, and those socioeconomic contradictions among local elites and between locals and foreigners. The source says these are mostly still in place today. Still major challenges.
Is there any indication of potential positive future directions? Any source of hope mentioned?
Well, the source suggests Grenada is again drawing on Caribbean cosmopolitan institutional wisdom for governance and cooperation, looking to regional models perhaps. For economic integration, there's an envisioned Caribbean autonomous economy fostering regional human capital that's presented as a goal.
And what about the internal relationship between Grenada and its sister islands, Carriacou and Petit Martinique?
The source touches on this. It says pre-1974 interterritorial feuds might be mostly in the past, but the 1990s saw a resurgence of nationalism after democracy was reestablished. Cooperation is described as proprietary, initially led by Grenadians.
Does it mention the impact of 1983 on that relationship?
Yes, a specific, very somber detail is included. Leading public sector intellectuals from Carriacou were reportedly largely obliterated in the 1983 violence. This tragic loss, the source suggests, points towards a future of perhaps perpetual codependence and ongoing interterritorial asymmetries of power between the islands.
We've certainly journeyed through a remarkable and often incredibly turbulent history today, from the ancient Amerindians right through European colonization, the brutal realities of slavery, and the long fight for freedom.
Yeah, then the complicated path to independence, that dramatic revolution and intervention, and now the ongoing challenges of rebuilding, finding Grenada's place in the modern world.
We've tried to pull out the key threads, highlight some surprising facts, and really navigate the complex layers of Grenada's story as it's presented in the source material you provided for us. Hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listener, a clear, maybe engaging and insightful shortcut to understanding this fascinating island nation's rich and challenging history.
Definitely food for thought. And thinking about the source text overall, what is Grenada's experience marked by both that incredible resilience you see time and again facing external shocks, internal conflict, but also the persistence of these deep structural challenges and political friction? What does that tell us about the long-term path of small nations trying to navigate this complex global landscape? And maybe for you listening, what aspects of this history do you feel deserve the deepest dive next?